Hello, everyone. Welcome to Urban's event, Reflections on the 2020 Census, Accuracy, Fairness, and Implications for the Decade Ahead. Before we begin, just a few words of housekeeping. The event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterward. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button. Speaker biographies and slides are posted online at urban.org. Right now, all participants are muted. We'd love to hear your questions and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So you can go ahead and type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. And then at the end, please complete the survey at the end of the event. And if you'd like to engage with us, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So to kick us off, I'm delighted to say that we had a big release today of a new report and 51 state fact sheets. The report is entitled Simulating the 2020 Census, Miscounts and the Fairness of Outcomes. So as I said, my name's Diana Elliott. I'm a Principal Research Associate here at Urban Institute. And I'm going to go ahead and just give a little bit of framing, present an overview of the goals of the work, the innovative approach that we used, and an overview of high-level findings before we jump into our really terrific panel discussion. Next slide. No census is ever perfect. Each decennial census has encountered challenges along the way, yet the 2020 census was conducted amidst unprecedented challenges. Demographic change was always going to make 2020 harder to conduct than prior censuses. As we showed in Urban's 2019 report, assessing miscounts in the 2020 census, demographic change alone would create an undercount. Our country now has more renters and is more diverse, factors that make it harder to count the population. Although the census is a scientific endeavor, it faced politicization in the years and months leading up to Census Day. There were reports of hesitancy among the foreign-born and non-citizens about participating. Finally, the lockdown at the start of the pandemic happened in mid-March of 2020. The same week, the Census Bureau sent initial postcards to the American public to encourage participation. The lockdown delayed fieldwork, created challenges counting some populations like apartment dwellers and college students, and led to relocations and confusion about where the public should report their usual residence. The 2020 census was conducted under tremendously challenging circumstances. Next slide. Consequently, these challenges have led some to question how accurate the 2020 census would be and whether the results would be fair. These questions are about the overall performance of the 2020 census, but also about equitable results and outcomes. There have been a few early studies of data quality indicators for the 2020 census, but few definitive answers. The post-enumeration survey is the official assessment of the quality of the decennial census, but it is unclear when it will be released for 2020 by the US Census Bureau. Consequently, there's a need for additional external benchmarks that can evaluate the census. Our next slide. Our study offers another way to understand the performance of the 2020 census. The goals of our study were to develop a microsimulation model where we could generate externally derived yet plausible benchmarks to understand the accuracy and fairness of the census, to produce estimates of miscounts for demographic groups and geographies with enough detail that we could understand the 2020 census performance, explore outcomes like political representation and federal funding allocations, and have a foundational model that we could refine with new data over the coming decade and have in place for 2030. Next slide. The work we did to create the data set and model in this study was highly technical. So I'm going to describe just at a very high level what we did, but I encourage you to explore the methodological details in the report if you'd like to learn more. So first, we created a baseline population for Census Day, or April 1st, 2020, derived from various Census Bureau data sources. Next, we adjusted those data to simulate the 2020 census environment. This includes actual 2020 self-response rates across US counties and adjustments for historical census accuracy rates by race, ethnicity, age, and homeowner or renter status, as well as by the citizenship status of households. All of these factors matter for whether someone is accurately counted or not. Finally, we randomized and modeled who was likely to be under, correctly, or overcounted. Our final data could then be used to explore scenarios for different groups and geographies. Next slide. So in this study, we explored two modeled scenarios. Scenario one is our simulated 2020 census. It explores the question, what will the 2020 census count be if we replicate known factors that produce miscounts? This scenario allows us to investigate 2020 census miscounts in our data. Scenario two is our hypothetical full count and explores the question, what if the true resident population of the US was counted completely, accurately, and only once? This scenario allows us to investigate what a perfectly executed census would be. In a sense, this is not achievable, but it presents us with a counterfactual to explore what a fair count could be. Next slide. So let's walk through some high-level findings from our model. Next slide. Overall, our estimated 2020 census finds that nationally, there is an overcount of 3.6%, an undercount of 4.1%, which culminates in a net undercount of 0.5% or 0.5%. Our model suggests that the 2020 census may not be as close to net accuracy as 2010 was, but also may not be as dire in terms of a net undercount as some had feared. Next slide. In our simulated 2020 census, Mississippi and Texas are the states with the most notable undercounts at 1.3 and 1.28% respectively. Minnesota has the most notable net overcount of 0.76%. We looked at outcomes such as federal reimbursements for Medicaid and how the counts could impact this. In our model, if Texas had a full count, the state would receive over $247 million more, or about 1% more in 2021 in federal reimbursements for Medicaid than what they currently receive. Meanwhile, Minnesota would receive $156 million less, or about 2.3% less than what they currently receive. This has implications for equity over the next decade, as not all residents across the US will receive their fair share of resources. Next slide. Our hypothetical full count scenario also finds that Minnesota would lose a seat in Congress from 8 to 7, and New York would gain a seat from 26 to 27. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that the hypothetical full count is virtually unachievable for various reasons. But this is a good thought exercise to really show how important a fair count can be for outcomes over the next decade. Next slide. When we look at miscounts by metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs, we see that Minneapolis-St. Paul has a likely overcount of a little over 1%. This is not surprising given Minnesota's performance in our model and their high self-response rate. They were the state in the country with the highest self-response rate at 75.1%. Meanwhile, Houston has a 1.38% undercount, which again reflects overall trends in Texas too. The Miami area has a large undercount in our data at 1.7%. Next slide. Looking at estimates by race and ethnicity, we see that Hispanic and Latinx people have a 2.17% undercount, and Black people have a 2.45% undercount in our data. In contrast, white non-Hispanic people have a 0.39% overcount nationally. Next slide. Looking at the findings by age, we see that young children or those under age 5 are undercounted by nearly 5%, while those age 50 and older are overcounted by almost 1%. Next slide. In our data, renters have an undercount of over 2%. Meanwhile, people in households with a non-citizen present have an undercount of 3.36% overall. This is just a preview of our findings in the report and 51 state fact sheets. I really strongly encourage you to go ahead and explore these resources online after the event. Next slide. So in conclusion, counting the US population is really hard, and it's getting harder every decade. Urban Simulated 2020 Census offers us a novel way to explore the accuracy and fairness of the 2020 census and a way to refine these estimates as new data become available. Overall, these data show that some communities and their residents will be shortchanged for the next decade due to an incomplete count. With innovations and investments over the next decade, we can ensure that the census, a cornerstone of American democracy, continues to perform at a high level of accuracy and to ensure the fair distribution of resources. Next slide. And now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. We're going to transition now to our panel discussion. So this includes Cara Brumfield, Senior Policy Analyst at Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, Ditas Kategi, Director of California Complete Count, Joseph Salvo, Institute Fellow at the University of Virginia Biocomplexity Institute and Initiative, and former Chief Demographer of New York City, and John Thompson, former Director of the US Census Bureau. Thank you all so much for joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and just kick us off with a question. We're going to talk a lot about accuracy and fairness today in this panel discussion. And I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with accuracy, since we just sort of had a preview of some findings about accuracy. So, excuse me. This is really a question for John and Joe. What do we know so far about the accuracy of the 2020 census? Do we have any indications that operational changes were successful? And either one of you can go ahead and just jump right in.
All right. So far, we have some bits and pieces. Connie Citro, for example, has done some work with demographic analysis. Bill O'Hare has done some work looking at children and looking at self-response rates. And the American Statistical Association Task Force, which Joe and I were on, looked at the data for states. But the urban data that you produced, Diana, is the first that has actual estimates of undercount by race, by states, and by sub-state areas, by race and ethnicity, I should say. So it's like our first glimpse into the potential accuracy of the 2020 census. Joe?
Yeah, what we know, John mentioned the ASA work that we did. What the ASA report showed is that behind the scenes, there was a tremendous amount of churning in Census Bureau operations. Some of it had to do with shifts in schedule, but a lot of it had to do with people submitting multiple responses, people submitting more than one response, and that had a lot to do with going to the internet. For the first time, really, You could submit a questionnaire without your census ID. So that created work for the Census Bureau and having to follow up on the addresses that they received. Census Bureau for the first time used administrative records in a serious way to try to curb the level of non-response follow-up. The imputation was used for group quarters facilities for the first time. There was a lot that went on behind the scenes, and it's natural to ask, does that generate error? And as John said, we are starting to get pieces of this picture. And what you have produced is one of those pieces. It's actually very interesting because it does produce what we call the components of error, both overcounts and undercounts, and he begins to give us a picture. And we all hope that the post-enumeration survey will be brought in as one of several methods in order to draw some conclusion.
Great. So we're starting to get glimpses of what the accuracy picture might look like. But again, that 2020 PES, we're all sort of anxiously awaiting to see what that's going to be like and when that will materialize. Great. So thinking about accuracy, now thinking about fairness, right? Both components are really important in this overall picture. What does it mean to have a fair census? What are the implications for fairness over the next decade? And is there anything we can do to remedy this? And I want to go ahead and start with Cara, and then maybe John contribute, and then we can just sort of see if Ditas and Joe want to jump in as well.
Great, thanks, Diana. I think it's a really great question because accuracy, of course, does not necessarily equate to fairness, right? Net coverage measures alone can even be misleading to a certain extent if an undercount of marginalized people is obscured by an overcount of the white population, for example, as so often is the case. And those disparities undermine fairness. That's sort of the key of what we're talking about when we're discussing fairness. And inequities in this data manifest in inequities in all spheres of American life. There are the federal funding formulas, of course, that rely on these data, census-derived data sets, and that has very real implications for the way that federal dollars flow into communities. And the decennial is also a civil rights issue. It's at the heart of our democracy. It's essential to the allocation of power within our political system. So when folks are missed, they're disenfranchised and they're disempowered. So I think we can thank the groups who worked on Get Out the Count and the census career professionals for the progress that we have seen and the success that we have seen, because without them, we'd be in a much worse spot. And I think many of us are concerned about these persistent undercounts. I know a lot of folks are concerned about the Black undercount in particular. National Urban League has been leading on this issue for decades and put out a statement on it last week. The Black undercount has been a huge problem from the beginning of the census. And I'm also concerned about fairness when it comes to other historically undercounted groups, Native Americans, other people of color, immigrants, people with low incomes, people experiencing homelessness, people in rural areas, and those displaced by these extreme climate-related events that we've been seeing happen more and more. These are all folks that the Census Bureau finds difficult to count even in the best circumstances. And so with the new challenges that we faced in 2020, it's been even harder to count those groups. And in terms of mitigation opportunities, I think there are a lot of things we can do that some others on the panel are better positioned to really go into. But I will just mention, of course, we have the challenge programs and preparing localities to engage in those, also investing in improving response rates to some of our intercensal data sets like the ACS. But I also think we really need to start working now to think forward to 2030. And a big part of that is going to be working to identify and crowd in the early mid-career professionals from racially diverse backgrounds who can really watch the census quality and fairness issues over the next decade and beyond, and who can step into important influential positions at the Bureau, who can do these census quality analyses, as well as the advocacy that needs to be done to ensure that we can continue to make progress on fairness over the coming decades.
So I would add just a few things. One, the census is also used to help enforce civil rights and to enforce, representative redistricting and representative hiring, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that I think is really important that Cara mentioned is to think ahead to 2030, because right now for apportionment, the data we have is out there. We've used that for apportionment. We're going to use the data in spite of any potential undercounts for redistricting. But to look ahead to 2030 and learn as much as we can from 2020 to reduce these undercounts in 2030. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Joe, Ditas, do you want to jump in and add anything to the conversation? No? Okay. Great. So let's talk about some of those local get out the count efforts, which, some of these efforts were truly impressive. Some states invested millions of dollars, like our colleagues in California, to make sure that the hardest to count were counted. So which investments are the ones that seem to make the most difference? Like, how do we know if these efforts paid off? Can we see that in the data? And Ditas, it would be great if you can jump in, and then maybe Joe wants to add something as well based on New York City's efforts.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Diana. There was absolutely amazing outreach efforts done across the country. So here in California, we were successful because of our fantastic partners and our staff. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the state of California, along with partners, invested over $222 million in census outreach for 2020. $187 million was directly from the state, and I oversaw and led those efforts. Another $35 million included from local government and private philanthropy. Now, for perspective, the US Census Bureau itself spent only $675 million for the entire country. So if you look at those state fact sheets that Diana talked about, in this study, it shows that California has an undercount rate of approximately 0.87%, and with about 345,000 folks missed. Now, if we compare that to our 1990 undercount of 868,000, our population was a lot smaller, and it may indicate that what we did here in 2020 worked despite the pandemic. So our campaign goals were really focused on educating and motivating 4 million hardest households in our hardest to count census tract. So we focused right deep down for all those folks that were at risk of being undercounted. Of those 4 million households, we said we need to activate 2 million of those households to actually fill out the census. So I'm proud to say that we exceeded that goal with 2.5 million households in our hardest to hardest count census tracts self-responding. We focused on self-response rates because we believe that the data would be more accurate if folks self-responded rather than being imputed or using administrative records. But what were our broader results for our investment? California achieved a self-response rate of 69.6%, and that's an estimated 10.5 million households self-responding, 2 million more households than we were able to get in 2010. And this was surpassed the national average self-response rate of 67%. I think that's pretty big, but we've surpassed it since 2000, so it was definitely a goal. So last December, our office did some preliminary analysis looking at self-response rates in our hardest to count tracts. And California achieved the highest average self-response rate in the hardest to count tracts among the 10 largest population states. So we feel this comparison, we want to compare it to the other states, the actual hard to count census tracts that the Census Bureau kind of put forth with their low responding scores. And we know that it was well invested to reach those hardest to count. but also harkening back to those studies, the studies fact sheets, I compared how we did with our race, ethnic, and their undercount rates. So Diana, thank you so much for those against the 10 other states. So I looked at this table, I kind of threw it together yesterday. And if you took the 4 largest states with populations over 20 million, which is California, Texas, Florida, and New York, and you compare the study's undercount rates by race, you'll find that California's undercount rates in Black, Latinx, API, or Asian, and mixed status household beat out all the other largest states. So I was super excited to discover this. So I wanted to just share a little bit about what our approach here in California was, not just that we had a whole bunch of money, and why it was so different than all the other states. First, it's important to note that this is my 3rd decennial census, so directing this. So we're able to start early as 2016 with a great foundation of actual census operations, as well as a full understanding of our hardest to count census tracts across the state. It allowed early investment. We had $7 million for local update of census addresses and $3 million for early outreach planning. Our Look at Incentive program resulted in a net 1.1 million new addresses being added. So our approach, and many folks did use this, data-driven with defined targeted geographic and demographic audiences. Plus we overlaid that with regional planning tables that are still being used today. We had an integrated and inclusive outreach and communications. We focused first on outreach, ground game, investing about $100 million to community partners. Then secondly, on air game, providing media and messaging support across the regions for a surround sound effect. Technology innovative. We had an award-winning SWORD GIS application, and SWORD stands for Statewide Outreach and Rapid Deployment. Not only did we use it for planning and coalition building, but it allowed us real-time analysis down to the local census tracts to redeploy based on the self-response rate released by the census. And in fact, it allowed us to do a mid-campaign pivot and redeploy in August 2020. So we focused on 21 counties that had lower and slower response rates, deployed different tactics in those areas, including a phone patch-through operation. And the data we have on those 955 census tracts shows that our investment worked. I just want to note that SWORD, it was a beta version. We were building it as we went, but our team updated it, put it with a C in front of it, and now it's COVID outreach and rapid deployment, which is right now being used to plan, track, and measure outreach efforts around our vaccination and pandemic education efforts. So our census investment was meant to be used beyond the census. At least that's what I promised all the legislators when I was begging for money back in 2016. We had trusted partners, which is a little bit different than, we had coined the term trusted messengers in Census 2000, but we'd had 15 years of this. We elevated it this time, starting as early as 2016, funding regional capacity building efforts, honoring those existing networks, and creating this ecosystem that worked together, which made a huge difference when COVID shut everything down in March 2020. So our contracted partners, they pivoted well because they'd been working together for 18 months prior to March 2020. They had trusted relationships and this really intense coordination infrastructure, and a firm understanding, of course, the data, targeted audiences, and our hard to count tracks. So while other states and localities were sort of coming up to speed, they were set to use that trusted messenger method to amplify census messages as well, as when March 20 came. We had this deeper operation with trusted partners and messengers. It was effective because instead of the state telling them what to do or message, they were actually on the ground letting us know what was really going on, how to best message, motivate, and work around COVID and Census Bureau operational challenges. And there were many. So it wasn't just one way. And this approach needs to be built in for 2020, as well as accountability. We had to build that in because with all that money, if we had not built it in, we wouldn't get anything for 2030. So accessibility, I want to talk about it really quickly. Huge part of our success, not just language, but we also worked with our disability rights community on developing our language and communication access plan, which far exceeded language access requirements for conducting outreach. Not only did we require contracted partners to conduct outreach in both English and Spanish statewide, we developed a highly ambitious language and communications access plan that covered an estimated 91% of our statewide limited English proficient population in their native languages. So the plan established language support requirements for on-the-ground partnerships to reach more than 6.7 million California limited English proficient residents age 5 and over. I mean, there are states that don't even have 6.7 million folks. The systems approach that we developed was this ecosystem. It had 7 areas, regional outreach approach delivered by 10 contracted partners through 10 designated outreach areas, rather, across the state, while leveraging and coordinating outreach efforts funded by our private philanthropy, which I'm grateful for. Of course, we had our communications and media campaign with culturally relevant and sensitive messaging. We had also a statewide approach through contracted partners that had statewide reach, expertise in designated vulnerable populations, as well as how to reach them through sectors. So faith-based, labor, business, healthcare. And then finally, we had our state agency outreach where executive branch constitutionals leveraged their communication platforms. So you can see we were weaving together this blanket of coverage. We had our complete count committee, we had our elected officials, and finally, the glue that pulled it all together was that we had data with technology, data and analytics, which provided our office the decision-making as well as visualizing contracted partner work in SWORD, PDI, and other integrated canvassing and phone banking apps. Finally, in 2016, I had promised any investment California made would need to result in social movement and capacity building, and we worked really closely with our philanthropic partners to ensure that happened. You can literally see our integrated census network we built is currently being used for the state's response to COVID-19. Again, I am so pleased that looking at this study's undercount by race and ethnicity, that California did better than many of the other larger states. But with our investment, it's not surprising. I encourage all of you to take a look at those state sheets and compare them. So in summary, really quickly, California's investment was huge and innovative. It was well worth it. I hope folks will continue to research and dig into the results, buy our hard to count census tracts and undercount rates. I think considering the pandemic, without this huge investment, I think California would have done a lot worse. So Diana, I know that was a lot, and I thank you for your research, and I hope that others will jump in. Take a look at what we did here in California, how our approach can serve as a national model, starting early planning for the 2030 census. So thank you. I'm going to turn that over to Joe. I know that was a lot, but I wanted to really highlight what we've done and how successful we were, and now the data is helping prove that out.
Okay. Let me say this in the interest of time. New York, if you go back to, this is my 4th census, and if you go back to 2000 and 2010, what you see is largely an outreach operation done with staff in kind within city agencies. A lot of volunteer effort using existing agency resources. In 2020, especially given the threats in immigrant communities, the city mobilized an effort to the tune of over $40 million, a staff of over 60 paid people who then reached out to hundreds of volunteers, one of which is in the first slide in this presentation. That was actually a picture of, I recognize the shirt of Bill de Blasio going to a door on a doorstep there. Mobilizing hundreds of volunteers in an effort to try to go into communities in the midst of COVID to get people to respond. The results, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here in anticipation of another question we may get. What surprised me a lot was the fact that New York State and New York City greatly exceeded its population estimate. And we're talking at the state level over 800,000 over the estimate, 629,000 over the population estimate for New York City, and probably 200,000 over what we considered, working in the Department of City Planning, to be the actual population of the city, far in excess of what we expected. Now, why is this important? And here's why. And this goes back to what Dita said earlier, one of the things she said. The model that's being used here is based on a whole series of relationships that we know about over time. For example, we know that renters don't answer the census as much as owners do. But what I want to ask is, perhaps some of these relationships got altered by virtue of the kinds of outreach that you're hearing about. that in effect, in California and in New York, in a number of communities, for example, we have immigrant communities, and this is taken into account in the model, where self-response in some immigrant communities was very high, and in others it was very, very low. The model does take that into account. But a lot of the relationships, well, that is the relation between variables like whether you own or you rent and other factors that influence whether you respond or not, perhaps some of those have been altered. And this is a limitation that you need to think about as we talk about all this. And I want to go back to something that's been discussed in a lot of forums, which is how do you have a level playing field in an environment where some cities like New York, and understandably so, I'm not going to apologize for the investments we made. I think they were great investments. And I should say also, again, to what Dita said earlier, we used our technology and our local know-how to add 250,000 housing units, either through units that were not on the list to begin with, or units that were added through new construction. Over 3 years, we worked on this effort. So through the local update of census addresses program. So I think that it was warranted, and it's important because New York is a very hard place to count. We know that, right? So in anticipation of a question I think that we're all going to hear is, what surprised you? What surprised me was the fact that despite 8.8 million in the city of New York and well over 20 million in the state of New York, well over our estimates, at the state level, there is still, according to this model, an undercount of over 1%, which means that plausibly New York City has almost 9 million people, which again exceeds the estimates that we have created. So just some caveats to just put this whole thing in perspective. Every model has its limitations, and those have been stated up front. Diana laid that out. And we need to take this into account because this is one of several ways of getting at this issue of what the quality was like in terms of coverage, as we say in demography, whether there were over or undercounts. I'll stop there.
Well, before we go into sort of the what surprised you question for real, we've had a really good question from the Q&A that tags along with something that you referenced, Joe. And the question is, some have argued that the infusion of state and local money into the census produces a different kind of inequality. States get the accuracy they can afford to buy to the disadvantage of those states that cannot invest in the census. How does the panel respond to this kind of criticism? Does anyone want to jump into that question?
So, I mean, I think I question that, like, for those states that can't afford to invest. And you have to say, again, it's about power and money. You saw the dollars that come back to those states in terms of federal programs. So I think it's short-sighted for the legislature to say, oh, we can't afford it, because I think you really can't not afford it, if that makes sense. In 2000, we invested 25 million and we got billions back in return. And that was the first time that California did that. So I think it's short-sighted to say, oh, we can't afford it, because you will lose. And your study shows by the state's fact sheets how much each state loses in those programs.
What if we thought about this from a different frame of reference? What John mentioned earlier, going forward. What if we mined all the information we have that is already out there, much of it public, for people that would perhaps allow us to get at a better enumeration without requiring these humongous investments, which frankly some places cannot afford to engage in. It is not a level playing field. And again, I'm not apologizing for investing $40 million. On the other hand, New York has a tough population. You need to enumerate. You need to invest that kind of money. But what about other places in the country where you don't have those resources and you have difficult to enumerate populations? This is a question as we look towards 2030 that we need to address.
Yeah, I think
I would amplify that, Joe. as long as you're doing the census the way we've been doing it for quite a while, where you have self-response, and then you go out and get those that don't self-respond or enumerate those, you will have entities like New York City and California, rightly so, which will invest tremendous amounts of money to increase their accuracy. And there are areas that can't afford that kind of investment, and they won't. So there will be inequities, but the best way to do it is look at the way we take the census and dramatically change that process into something different if you want to eliminate these kind of inequities.
I mean, I think you have to look about, if you're saying level playing field, I mean, come on, LA City is like the hardest to count city and the hardest to count county and the hardest to count, state, 192 different languages spoken. So, if you're going to level the playing field, as John and Joe have both said, you got to think about how you actually operate, because it's going to be harder, to actually get folks to respond, with language barriers, with digital divide, and with, frankly, the suppression sort of the count of people not wanting all residents to be counted. So you got to level the playing field on the operations side as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as someone with maybe a different perspective on this, that what I would like to see is more federal investment. I think ideally we would, the census outreach would be funded, and all of these operational efforts and get out the count, all of this would be funded at the federal level so that states wouldn't have to compete with each other in order to have access to a fair count of their population. I think that's what's truly needed to have a fair count in the country, is more investment at the federal level. And I think it's a matter of priorities. If we want to invest in the census as the statistical backbone of our democracy, then we need to make those investments at the federal level. And it is possible to make progress on these undercounts if we do that, if we make it a priority for ourselves as a nation.
Great, thank you. And thank you, participant, for that great question. So I'll now pivot to a question that was teed up, which I think Joe and Dita answered a little bit, but I'll let Cara and John have the first pass at this. Did anything surprise you in the findings overall? What surprised you, if so?
Cara, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. All this time in the pandemic and still struggling to find the unmute button. I think that in terms of what surprised me, I think that, this analysis indicates that the undercounts, which we all were expecting, were perhaps not as bad as we feared. I think, to Ditas's point, the state-by-state comparisons are incredibly illuminating. And, I think I'll just reiterate that, despite the fact that we will never have a perfect census, these persistent gaps in differential undercounts between subpopulations are really unacceptable. And they're almost baked into even the best case scenarios for the census. And I don't think that we can be satisfied with that.
It's difficult to add anything to that excellent summary that Cara gave, but I think that what surprised me, in addition to the level of the undercounts, I thought they might be a little higher because of a lot of factors, but was the simulations that you did on reapportionment. So I had thought, that states with large undercounts like Texas maybe would actually get another representative, but they didn't. So it shows what I understand about the reapportionment formula, but that did surprise me a little bit.
Ditas, Joe, do you want to jump in and add anything else there?
Well, I kind of certainly hinted at what I felt was the fact that New York State did quite well in the census, and New York City especially. But again, I want to point to the paradox of all this. It's showing an undercount in the model, but at the same time, the count is apparently quite high. There was talk before the census of New York State perhaps losing 2 seats. And of course, when it was announced at the Census Bureau's press conference that the other seat with Minnesota just was on the cusp by 89 people, it opened up a whole series of questions. And I cannot tell you how much that week I used the phrase, all else being equal. That once you go down that path of trying to figure out, if I had gone down the block and I had gotten a bunch of people to answer, we wouldn't have lost the seat. Well, no, that's not the way it works. One of the things, perhaps a suggestion I'd like to see is a sensitivity analysis, or running. You in the report, you talk about how you have the ability to run a whole bunch of different scenarios, and I wonder what would happen if you did indeed try to do that. Much like Connie Citro did in her work with the evaluating undercounts and overcounts by race and Hispanic origin. But the thing that really, I don't want to say surprised me, but that bothered me the most was the undercount of young children. Here we go again. It's big, and it's just persistent. And despite all the efforts that have been put in by Bill O'Hare and a whole bunch of people at the Bureau, my hope there is that the PES might reveal something better. But it was quite discouraging, specifically about young children under 5.
I think the one thing that in looking those state data sheets was that I noticed an overcount of AIAN, which was kind of astounding in 4 states, I think, at least the 4 big ones I looked at. I was pleased because we put a lot of effort into that in California, but I'm really curious what happened there with some of the other states that may or may not have done as much outreach. And is that some kind of, anomaly, or what is that? So that was surprising.
Great, thank you all for that. I think we had some surprises internally too. And again, to your comment, Joe, we'd like to expand this model and do more digging. And we see this really as just the starting point for what we can do here. So I'm going to transition to some questions from the participants right now. So I think this is a great question, and it's one that often gets confusing to people. Undercounts make sense to me. Can the panelists expand a bit on how and why some communities are overcounted? And maybe, John, it makes sense to start with you on that one.
Sure. So there are lots of ways that you can overcount communities. One is you have duplicates on your address list, and so you count them twice, and you don't find them and take them out. Other ways are you could have a self-response, and then you could have a non-response follow-up enumerator going to a house and enumerating it. As Joe had mentioned, you could have someone that comes in with a non-ID response, and that duplicates a house that did have an ID because they responded twice. These are just examples of a few. I think the really important thing to understand, though, about overcounts and undercounts is they tend to occur in different areas and for different population groups. And the effect of that is it exacerbates the level of unfairness in the allocation of funds, in the allocation of voting representation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the unfortunate thing about overcounts is they don't happen where there's undercounts in general, and they don't cancel out at local levels.
Anyone want to add on to that? All right. With that, I'll jump to another really great question from a viewer. Any theories on what prevented the undercount from being less dire than feared? Reliance on administrative records, ability to respond online. I have some thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear from the panelists.
There's no question in my mind that responding online gave the Census Bureau an edge. But I want to say tenacity on the part of Census Bureau staff, because they will tell you, if you talk to anybody in operations in the Census Bureau, and the nightmare scenario is always changing a deadline or the timing of an operation every 20 minutes. And it seemingly appeared that way, certainly as we went through March, April, May, and into the summer of 2020, where things got really difficult from a political standpoint. So tenacity is certainly a part of this on the part of the Bureau staff, the ability to operate under extreme political pressures and so on. But I do believe that there's a strong sense of mission, and that's what got them through. And let me just say this, the fact that the 2020 census happened by itself is pretty amazing. Because there was a period of time that a whole bunch of us thought that there's just too much happening here. So I'll leave it at that.
Let me add a little something, and that is, while I think this is a great simulation that the Urban Institute did, it did start with the 2010 PES and then built forward. So until we really get some good measures, additional measures, rather, I shouldn't say good measures, additional measures of the accuracy of the 2020 census, it might be a little premature to say that that the undercounts weren't more severe, because when we do get demographic analysis out at the national level, we'll understand a little bit more about the undercounts for certain population groups. And if the PES is successful, and that's a question, that might also shed some more light on the actual level of undercounts. So until we get more information, I don't know that I'd really want to conclude that the undercounts weren't more severe in 2020.
I'll also add, I just have to shout out again the Get Out the Count groups, who were absolutely essential to, whatever level of success it turns out that we were able to achieve in 2020, as well as just sort of the people, the people who went ahead and responded despite a global pandemic, economic insecurity, being displaced by climate-related disasters. It's really amazing that people found the time and the space to do this, because it's so important for our democracy.
I think there's a lot of lessons learned from both what was done throughout the nation, but also I think the Census Bureau needs to take a look at their partnership program, at their integrated communication and partnership. We flipped ours around. Ours was about partnership and outreach first. And I hope that they start this year or next year to let's dig in, let's bring in folks from around the nation to really say what worked and how can we build a model? How can we continue to build this sort of social movement, as we call it here in California, to make sure that it lays the groundwork so we don't have to come back and rebuild everything in 2028, right? Let's make those data dissemination specialists that the US Census Bureau has in the communities that are, kind of less, they're more reactive. Let's have them have goals to create these community data officers, partnering with those nonprofits and the foundations. More and more folks are understanding how important data is for equity, empowerment, and engagement, right? The census is power, money, and data. And instead of being public servants focused on effectiveness, efficiency, and economy, let's move our government, local, state, federal, to equity, empowerment, and engagement. So, yeah.
Great, thank you all. And that kind of tags along with another question that we got from the audience, which is how much evaluation, if any, has been done on the effectiveness of various local efforts to achieve a full count? I know that this was somewhat raised as a critique, I think, by the GAO about 2010, right? That some of the efforts in 2010 weren't really evaluated or understood in terms of investments and the payoff in the end. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about this, and how would we evaluate whether local investments yielded notable results?
So I'll note that, on our census.ca.gov website, we have our final report plus appendices. We also did 2 independent evaluations, both about our communications, just the media campaign, as well as our outreach campaign. I will admit, though, that, because we thought we were only going to have $3 million instead of 187, that at the beginning we didn't build that in. I think, we have a whole, looking forward what folks, states, what California should be doing for the future. And part of that is making sure that right up front, 4 years before, you set up, the correct sort of evaluation methodology. So I think Census Bureau needs to go ahead and evaluate what they did as well, in combination with what was done out in the field.
In order to do any evaluation, the likes of which you're suggesting, we need small area metrics on the success of the enumeration. We need to know below the state level what these quality indicators will tell us. Things like how many cases were imputed, the success of the operation at a local level, juxtaposed with the outreach efforts, looking at areas, not at the state level, but neighborhoods, to see those places where there was a lot of outreach. Did we indeed have greater response? And as a result, we know self-response. We have good metrics on self-response, but we don't have good metrics on things like imputation, on things like the deployment of administrative records, the kinds of things you need to know that can be analyzed in order to answer your question.
That's also, it's very, very hard to analyze the effects of advertising on ultimate accuracy or even self-response advertising in partnership. So for example, you don't have a trial where you have a control group. You don't have a city where you say, oh my God, we didn't do any advertising here, or we didn't do partnerships. You could compare the results. So it does get very, very tricky to try to analyze the ultimate effect of partnership and advertising.
Great. We are winding down. We only have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to use moderator's prerogative and ask you all a question that you're not prepped for. But I think we're all thinking about it and we're talking about it. So based on what happened in 2020, what needs to happen in 2030? Anyone can jump in.
We need to let go of the current paradigm, the current approach in some significant ways. We need to rethink. The population is not responding. 67% occurred over 5 months. Remember that. And it did not budge after May or June. Okay. So we need to rethink how we take the census, and we need to do it soon.
So I think that, I agree with, it being, I saw a comment about it being unfair for other states that haven't had invest, that the federal, Census Bureau and the federal government needs to fund outreach in an equity-based way. And we need to create models way earlier than, 2028. We need to start, practicing and putting in the stuff in 2024, and because it's going to take 6 years to build a national sort of movement where it's equitable and everybody is aware of what they need to do and what the resources that is needed to actually get the count complete.
Yeah, I'll just underscore what Dita said. I think we need to start early. We need to start now, and we need to invest, and we need to be extremely intentional about prioritizing the equity and the fairness of this census.
I guess I'm more on Joe's point, and that is we've been looking at self-response for censuses, and it really hasn't budged over the years. We've been looking at the undercounted children going back to 1990, and it hasn't changed despite an awareness of it. So you really need to rethink the way you take the census and say, what do I have to do different in order to address these historical patterns of inaccuracy?
Thank you all so much. We're actually at time. As you all know, I could keep talking about this for hours, but people do have things to do today. This was really terrific. I have learned so much from each of you, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much to our attendees. Your questions were terrific. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we look forward to having more conversations about this in the future. Take care, everyone, and have a good rest of your afternoon.